Richard, you've written a book. It's this book, Rugby League on this
Mm.
day. There it is. Nice picture on the back as well. Why have you written this book?
Well, I love the history of rugby league, Richard. I really do. I think rugby league has got the most phenomenal, fantastic, amazing, wonderful history, and it's not just games and players. There's all sorts of funny, quirky stories where you sort of think only in rugby league could that have happened. And I've tried to pull as much of it together as I can. I think in terms of me as a writer, I got very bored with journalism. I got very bored with going to games and press conferences, and I realized very quickly it wasn't me. I was the editor of Rugby League World for a while, and when they decided they wanted someone else to do that job, which is fair enough because I don't think I was very good at it, I decided I wanted to concentrate on the history of the game. So in League Express, I interview an ex-player every week. It's David Hobbs this week. And I absolutely love doing that. But before I started this series of ex-players, I used to write the On This Day column. So there's 366 days to cover, obviously. So I had them all written up quite a few years ago, but getting around to publishing it, and I kept finding new stories and better stories. And there had to be a point where I just thought, come on, stop, let's just get it published now. So the book basically is 366 stories on rugby league, ranging from 1866 to 2022, with the England wheelchair lads beating the French a month or so ago. I loved that so much, I had to put it in. It was just so unbelievable. And I know you said on this show a few weeks ago that people stumble across the wheelchair game and they say exactly that. Wow, it's incredible. I didn't realize. And that was me a few weeks ago watching that. So I've got that in. So that's the most modern story. I've tried to cover as many of the legendary games and players as possible. But as I said, lots of quirky stories in there as well that are a bit different. So 366 rugby league stories for 12 quid. So I hope people will think that's a bargain and they'll hopefully buy one off me.
I mean, you can just flick through and find just anything random on any day of the year. How difficult was it just to narrow things down to one per day?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's difficult for May because there's all the Challenge Cup finals have happened. So, there's some amazing ones that I haven't included. So, for example, I think off the top of my head, the Wigan Hull final is on the same date as the Wigan Dewsbury final from 29 when we went to Wembley for the first time. So you got to choose between those two, for example. And yeah, I mean, you know what rugby league's like. Straight away, people say, "Well, why isn't this in it? Why have you missed out this?" So I got into trouble with an Egremont Rangers fan because I one of the things I did publicising the book on a Workington forum was saying that I'd included the story of Ellenborough Rangers, who in '98 beat two professional teams in the Challenge Cup, Bramley and Hunslet. And he immediately said, "Well, why haven't you got us beating Workington from that same year? We beat them 18-0. We're the only amateur team to nil a professional club." There's always an angle, isn't there? But I went with Ellenborough, who were the only team, I think, to beat two professional teams in 1 year. So, yeah, there's tough choices because there's probably millions of stories that are fascinating enough to get in, and I could only choose 366.
I mean, it wouldn't be rugby league if you didn't upset someone, would it? That's the and it's not as if you're running the sport. You've just written a book. I mean, what was the what would you say was the most interesting thing you discovered, either when writing the column in the past or more recently for the book?
Well, I always remember when I was at uni, I went out to buy my copy of League Express one Monday morning in '97, and I just howled with laughter because the main story on page 3 was this fella who a couple of weeks earlier had bought League Express and read his own obituary. And that was the Wakefield Trinity fullback from '46, Billy Teal, in the first cup final after the war. And I love that story, and it led to the great, what I think is the greatest letter in the League Express mailbag ever. Thank you for my nice obituary, but I'm not dead. And the explanation was that the writer had just seen that somebody of the same name in the same area had died and had put two and two together and got it wrong. And I thought that was a lovely story, and I'd always remembered it. So I went and found the date that they'd printed the wrong obituary, and so I included that story. So I've tried to mix it up. I've tried to get some nice quirky stuff in there. Now there's lots of Australian stuff because I've got a huge love and knowledge of the Australian game, particularly the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I've tried to mix it up, but yeah, I think that's one of my favourites. And I think Minnie Cotton storming onto the field with her handbag, and then 6 weeks later with her umbrella. A lot of people don't realise she did it twice in 6 weeks, but so Minnie Cotton's in there. I think there's lots of quirky stories. There's lots of sad stories as well. Like I say, try to mix it up and get all sorts.
Yeah, it can't all be positive. It can't all be funny, can it? we do have a fascinating history, which I think, as we've said at times, sometimes we don't necessarily play upon enough, I don't think, as a sport.
Well, I think in 1996, we went into the new era with this collective attitude that rugby league used to be crap, basically, and now it's going to be brilliant. And you can't do that. The collective message, and Richard Lewis actually wrote word for word in the Sky Sports magazine in 2010, rugby league used to be big guys wrestling in the mud, fat guys wrestling in the mud, something like that. Now, I suspect somebody might have written that for him, but nevertheless, that was what went out from him when he was running the game. And that denigrates 100 years of history because, you know, he's talking about the era that Alan Hardesty played in, the era that Gus Risman played in. He's talking about the whole 100 years of being fat guys wrestling in the mud. And rugby league was wonderful, magnificent from 1895 to 1995. And if you choose to market your product in basically it used to be crap and now it's great, then why would people believe you? Because you'd have previously been saying it was great. You can't do that. And we've got a very negative attitude towards the history. I think a lot of, I've always been an expansionist, but I think a lot of expansionists tend to be a bit snobby about a lot of the great rugby league towns or villages in some cases because they're not big metropolitan cities. And I think so a lot of the great rugby league towns are on the wrong end of that sort of an attitude as well, that we don't want the likes of Featherstone and Oldham and Batley and Workington playing our game. You know, we want Barcelona and Milan. And there was a lot of that nonsense in the mid-90s as well, wasn't there? And I just think that the Super League rhetoric really is still there to an extent. And there's this attitude that is rather unfortunate, I think. And I think the history of rugby league 10, 15 years ago used to depress me a bit more than it does now. But I think there's more clubs are sort of celebrating their history a bit more, which I like.
Yeah, I think I've always used the example, and when people say Barcelona or Milan or whatever, it would be as if the Canadian Football League put a team in Leeds. Why would people go to watch it? Because they've no idea what this is.
The Milan story is hilarious because what it came from was Maurice Lindsay was doing a press conference talking about the possibilities, and he just suddenly said Milan, and then asked to justify this. He said, "Well, John Kerwin's wife is Italian," and that was it. John Kerwin was an All Black anyway; wasn't even a rugby league player just because he had an Italian wife. That was where Milan came from. So when people like us laugh about that, it's always Milan that gets mentioned, and that was the reason for Milan being mentioned. John Kerwin's wife.
We could have picked any of the Italians in Sydney these days. I mean,
I know.
Italy are in the world. I mean, imagine what Maurice would have made about the World Cup coming up. I mean, he's obviously been a divisive figure, but one, as we mentioned on the program when he died, who did so many things for the sport, good and bad, that his legacy will probably be with us forever now.
Was it you that called him Rugby League's Maggie Thatcher? Because I thought it, and then I heard someone say it, and I thought, damn, I wanted that line because I thought it.
I don't know if I'm the first person to say it, but I did say it on the program. So yes, that is
right. Well, I did think it because I went on a episode of Backchat with Ralph Rimmer when he was first given the job, and so I worked out that Ralph is only the 9th person to do that particular job, because some people ran the game for 30 odd years, like Bill Fallowfield and John Wilson, and guys like that did the job for so long that we've only actually had 9 different people in 127 years. Maurice, I don't know. I think Maurice got so much wrong. I really do. I mean, what he did at Wigan, of course, first time round was phenomenal. But what he then did at the RFL, I don't know, because he just happened to be in the hot seat when that £87.5 million check dropped in his lap. It could have been anyone running the game. There was always, it was inevitable at the Super League war that they were going to try and get the English on side from the international point of view. And obviously, the television over here, Sky TV, Rupert Murdoch, there was obviously a link. So it's not like Maurice went out there and made it happen. He always liked to tell the story that it was 75 million, then he beat it up to an extra 12.5. Which, fair enough, I'm sure that's true. But I think a lot of the things he did, I would question now whether he got it right. The 10-meter rule, for example, I think the game has evolved now into more of a forwards game, whereas you would think summer rugby, it would be more of an outside backs game. I think a lot of the changes that he made, the way the Super League was executed with 6 clubs basically who should have been in that division, suddenly Keighley being the best example, not being allowed in. He didn't seem to care who he upset, did he? And I think that's maybe where the Maggie Thatcher thing came from, that he was looking after the people at the top and he didn't really give 2 hoots about, the people in the middle or the people at the bottom. Well, we don't want to start political arguments, of course, and get people angry with the show. So I wouldn't dream of taking that analogy any further. But one thing Maurice was good at, though, he was high profile. He was great with the media. He got celebrities to Wembley every year to watch the cup finals and the internationals. He got out there. He wined and dined with the sports editors on Fleet Street, and he certainly did good things. And then I think by the second time round at Wigan, he tried to create what he'd done first time round, and I think he failed quite. I think Wigan were then rescued by Lenigan. But we do need, having said all that, we do need more Maurice Lindsays, though. We need more people who will loudly beat the drum and get us out of there. There's too many anonymous figures in the game, and Maurice certainly had good points.
And you are right, when those who are around do bang the drum, it's usually of a negative persuasion or very much. And I can understand why club chairmen want to put their club first, but it's not a great look for the sport in general when we have chairmen coming out and saying daft things on social media or on their own club websites, as they're allowed to do.
You're right. But Maurice attracted a lot of negativity himself. I mean, he sent 12 players home from the 96 tour of New Zealand to save on hotel bills. I mean, that was absolutely awful PR for the sport, wasn't it? When he quit the RFL and then jumped over to the Super League Europe, I remember the front copy of League Express, the front page was that he described something as dross, drivel and other words. And they were the three big words on the front of League Express, that he basically said he was fed up of having to deal with the dross and dribble. I think something had happened at Keighley, that I think the turnstiles were broken and it had landed on his desk. And that was what he said. I'm fed up of having to deal with dross and dribble and just wanted to deal with the big clubs. And that was caused a bit of a stir as well. So there you are.
Broken. I mean, at least, imagine what he would have made of the St. Helens tweet last week of the chairs at Bellevue. So, the more things change, the more things stay the same. I can't believe that you got bored. I can't believe you got bored of going to press conferences, because they're always full of insight and interest that fills the paper week in, week out.
I hated them after a while. There are people who have been rugby league journalists for decades, and I admire them so much. And I often say to Martin Sadler, how have you done this job for so long? Because your editorial this week could have been word for word your editorial in 1992 or 2001, that you're still arguing about the same issues. And I think I'm the sort of person who loves rugby league so much, and I can't understand why it's not bigger. So you start lashing out and blaming people. And I think now I can see that, and I can see that that's maybe not the right thing to do. And I think being confrontational, maybe as much as guys like Andrew Foster on Twitter, for example, who I'm sure you know who he is, I'm very much his type of fan in many ways. But there's another part of me that thinks that, the fact that we are still a full-time sport at the top level, and the fact that England could play a World Cup final and there'd only be 6 points in it, part of me thinks maybe in some ways we actually overachieve a little bit, because there's never been any money in rugby league. We've always had a very narrow geographical pool to get players and fans from. And part of me thinks that the fact that we can still have a Super League competition is decent, and I thought the bash at the weekend was really good, and the women's game is fabulous. I kind of now think that maybe my approach to the job, maybe I was a bit negative, and when you do the job like that, I don't think you've got too much of a shelf life, because you can't keep having the same arguments with yourself.
One of the first things when I got into broadcasting in 2002, I was told to do was to stay off the rugby league forums, because even though obviously everything's anonymous, people knew who I was. So I had opinions on the way Wakefield was being run at the time.
Rugby league forums.
I mean, I can't believe they're still going and still full of probably the same people saying the same nonsense. But not that everyone.
There was the first forum I went on was an Australian website called ourleague.com. And ourleague.com was a really big website. And they had a forum. There must have been about 10 or 12 of us arguing with each other all the time. But one of the loudest and most aggressive arguers was actually who you'll know now as Damien Irvine. He used to post under the name Beaker Shark. And wow, I mean, he could start an argument in an empty cemetery. And I'm the same. And I remember sort of going hammer and tongs with him over various issues. And I remember other people who are still, a couple of I've even used as writers, like Bryce Eulenstein and Jason Emery, and there was only a few of us, and that was my first experience. I loved it. But now, so there's Twitter these days, and like I say, I've lost a lot of the energy and passion for this sort of stuff. I'd much rather watch a Yorkshire Cup final from 1980 than something from today, or in the men's game. But that's just me, and we all move in different ways. At least I haven't sort of walked out and don't watch the game anymore. Like a lot of my friends from the 90s who I used to go to rugby league games with, I didn't want to just sort of fall out of love with rugby league completely, like a lot do.
I think the high watermark was Wakefield having an official club forum, which is a ridiculous idea on the start of it, and having the chief executive post as Chief Egg. That was their name on the forum. But
they all had forums on the website, didn't they? Because I don't think they realised what would happen, and then they all very quickly had to take them down. Because you'd have to employ someone full time to monitor them, wouldn't you?
Clubs can't afford someone to do that these days. There's too much hassle. It's bad enough on. I mean, I was obviously briefly employed at Wakefield, and when you see the comments coming on the official Facebook and Twitter feeds, you're just like, I would probably have just banned everyone, and that's probably why I didn't last too long. But I just have no patience for just morons. You mentioned that the modern game. I was at the Bash yesterday. I didn't see any of Saturday. What did you make of the bits you saw from heading?
Well, I enjoyed it. I really did enjoy it. I sort of dipped in and out of it. The highlights for me, I'm a Workington fan, so no highlights in that game. I think Town are pretty much down now, but genuinely hats off to Whitehaven. They've struggled a bit this season, but they've had a lot of injuries. But they've had Gary Charlton last year and John Tigorley this year. Obviously, two recent coaches or assistant coaches of Town, and I think a lot of those two guys. So I'm pleased to see them doing well. I think a lot of Paul Crary at Barrow, and a lot of their best players are ex-Town players as well. T. Richton, who should be in Super League. Jared Stack should have gone to Super League 5 or 6 years ago if Super League clubs weren't so negative about the championship. Jared Sammer also played for Town. What a player. So I enjoy watching Barrow doing well. And wow, what a season they're having. They're having the sort of season Whitehaven had last year. But I hope they're sort of able to sustain it next year as well. I think the big story, though, are Lee the greatest club in the lower divisions ever? I saw someone write that on Twitter, so that's had me thinking, as a rugby league historian, I've been trying to think of a better one, but they may well be. And Featherstone, wow, Brian McDermott. Doesn't he only offer feast or famine as a coach? There's never any in between. He wins Super League 1 year, he's fighting relegation the next year, then he wins Super League again, then he's getting sacked. And now Brian is a very fascinating individual, isn't he? I'm very fascinated by coaches, and Brian has a uniqueness about him, and he has a personality that is very different and very out there. And I do wonder whether his players are always going to buy into what he's saying and the messages he's going to get across. And I just think with Brian, when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. And I went on the Featherstone forum last night just to sort of monitor what they think of him, and there's not much love for him there. And I just wonder whether he's sort of rugby league's Mourinho now, with all his trophies on his CV, but someone who's maybe just going to be very short term at clubs, put a rocket through them and then be heading off for pastures new in a year or two. Who knows?
I can't write him off because, I mean, you've mentioned on October 5th, 2017 grand final, and obviously there were other reasons perhaps that Castleford didn't perform on that day, but they were nowhere that season, and Danny Maguire had his probably best ever game and they won. So I can't write them off. Well, the fans have never been behind him either.
No, well, Leeds fans fell out of love with him very quickly. I mean, I don't know if you've, I haven't had a Super League press pass for a long time, but I used to sit in his Harlequins press conferences, and there were times when he'd get up and leave, and seasoned veterans like Ray Fletcher would sit there and say, I've never seen anything like that. And Ray Fletcher would have his mouth wide open, and Hadfield would be looking around, and did that just happen? And they were regular occurrences. I think rugby league needs people like Brian, but it's very fascinating because there is a pattern there, that there is a Mourinho-esque pattern that when it goes wrong, it's probably gone. But like in 2011 and 2012, when they were rubbish throughout the regular season and they win the grand final. So you're right. If anyone can win that grand final for Featherstone, it's probably Brian. But
I mean, when he was linked with the Wakefield job, which I don't think he was ever going to get because he probably cost too much money, I would have snapped someone's hand off to have him there just because of his record in the past. But I also would have appointed Ian Millwood over John Keir in 2006, which shows you what I know about rugby league, which is absolutely nothing. So who knows how I've got away with this for so long. It was interesting speaking to John Tigorley after that game yesterday, because I was sat near the Premier Sports commentary, so I could hear everything they were saying throughout. It was interesting watching them because they're up and down, up and down, up and down. Leon Price it was like he was playing the game, But Kyle Amor mentioned towards the end of the commentary about the potential of a Cumbria Super Club, which I think has been going on as a discussion longer than even the initial Super League talks. And Gawley did say in I say press conference, it was just me, in the interview after the game, that maybe that's something that needs to happen in the future. But it's okay, everyone down here in Yorkshire and Lancashire saying, oh, you must have a big super club, the Cumbrian Lakers or whatever, because we don't have the history and the rivalry that you're not having to throw away, because I'm sure you can have some kind of second tier clubs alongside. But as he said, they're both fighting for the same player pool. So it makes sense in that sense.
Yeah, firstly, when you mentioned Gawley and Price in the same sentence, I think I'm right in saying that Leon sacked Jonty as his assistant. Now, if I'm wrong about that, I'll apologise, but that doesn't look a good decision, does it? Jonty was always someone who we at Workington knew would go on to be a successful head coach one day, but then unfortunately that happened, and he's now been a head coach at our rivals, and they've managed to pretty much now, you would say, stay up despite having a lot of injuries, and I think they're going to be a good competitive Super League club for a while. Sorry, Championship club for a while with Jonty as head coach, and good on him. He's a smashing fella, and I'm pleased to see him doing well. On the subject of Cumbrian Super League, of course, that is an example of what I was saying earlier about having the same conversations for years. I think my answer 10 or 15 or 20 years ago would have been to have a new club in Super League and Workington, Whitehaven and Barrow stay as feeder clubs. But I don't think there's the resources to have an extra club and to have 4 clubs. But another thing that people miss out is the fact that Barrow is actually a long way away from Workington and Whitehaven. Because, of course, Barrow, before the boundary changes in the early 70s, was actually in Lancashire. So you can't. People used to sling Carlisle in there as well, which is an hour north, and Barrow's an hour south. You couldn't merge. Well, Barrow and Carlisle technically merged, didn't they? But not really. So the merger involving them all was always a bit of a fantasy. So it would only be Workington and Whitehaven. I think Barrow are doing well because they've got South Cumbria to themselves, whereas, as you say, Workington and Whitehaven are sharing West Cumbria. But there's been times in the past, Workington and Whitehaven for 3 consecutive seasons got into the top 8 in the Championship playoffs in 13, 14 and 15 before they both got relegated in 16. So, I mean, I think it can be done. I think Whitehaven and Barrow have been rewarded for staying local coaches with a big knowledge of the amateur game. I'm a big fan of Chris Thorman, and I never like coaches being sacked because I think he'll be better for the experiences he's had this year. But if someone does decide that a coaching change is going to happen, whether that be Chris or the club, I hope Workington go local and tap in. Because, I mean, clubs like Wathbrow and Kells and Egremont and Seaton and Hensingham, they're all in the national leagues, and they are fabulous clubs with so many players and second teams and youth teams of all sorts of age groups. And not many of those guys ever seem to want to play for Workington and Whitehaven. And I don't know why that's necessarily the case. And I don't blame them. They're great clubs in their own right. And I just think if we could find a way of smoothing out that pathway and getting people into the professional game from the amateur game, then you would have the talent then. But when the Kells and Wathbrow lads just want to stay at their clubs, and Egremont as well, then Workington at Whitehaven aren't then accessing the best Cumbrian amateur players, which you would think is what they have to do.
Now, the one club which does have, as you say, access to the almost the monopoly on South Cumbria, but the Barrow ladies have pretty much the monopoly of the whole of Cumbria. Speaking to Amanda Wilkinson after the game yesterday, and they got promoted last year. Their aim was to consolidate their position. They're second in the table behind Warrington, who obviously had a ridiculous result yesterday against Wakefield. But Barrow may be the Cumbrian force in Women's Super League, and that can only be a good thing for the sport in general, in widening the player pool and making sure that the Cumbrian players don't have to, like the players in the North East who travel to Leeds, have to make ridiculous sacrifices to travel for training every week.
Yeah. I watched Barrow play against St Helens first game of the season. It was live on the iPlayer, and people get very negative about one-sided games. I suppose, look, the Wakefield-Warrington score is not good. But I watched St Helens beat Barrow 72-0, I think, off the top of my head, 68-72. And I thought Barrow were very good. And I watched that, and I thought, there's a team there. There's good players there. And knowing the sort of club that Barrow are, and they're a fabulous club now, doing everything right, I just thought that there's, I didn't know much about the league they were going into, but I'm not surprised to see them as a joint top, or maybe second, just slightly behind Warrington. And I think that, there's clearly some real talent at the top of that division. I think they got at least one player from Wigan, the second row, Vanessa Templeton. Yeah.
She's got a great interception yesterday as well.
Yeah, she came from Wigan. So and the Amanda Wilkinson connection, of course, as well. So but looking at the top flight, you would hope that if Warrington go up, you'd hope they'd put some resources into it, because they've obviously got the money to do that, and to really back them, and to maybe recruit a couple more, and to keep developing. But Women's Rugby League, that is where the growth potential in rugby league is. And if people don't know that, then they haven't watched. If people who are watching don't know that, then I don't know what they're watching. Because you only have to look at the Lionesses, but you only have to look at women's sport everywhere to know that that's where the growth potential is. We've had 30 years nearly of wondering why, when Wigan play St Helens in a magnificent game, people don't come flocking in to watch. But there's a ceiling that's just above our heads in men's rugby league. But in women's sport, that is where the growth potential is. And I've tried my hardest to get, for example, League Express to cover the women's game more, to give it more space and to cover it more positively. They do a decent job, and Lorraine Marsden's great. No arguments there, but just more space. And I think the game as a whole needs to make superstars out of these people. I'm writing, as you know, I'm publishing Shani Crowell's autobiography. What a story she has. What an amazing personality. What an absolutely wonderful, wonderful person she is. And what a brilliant player. I spoke to her yesterday after the game. She was so modest. And then I find out in League Express that she was the game star, player of the match. And she's obviously praising everyone else. She's a superstar. She is exactly the sort of personality that rugby league is crying out for. And there's a lot of real personalities and superstars in the women's game for a couple of reasons. One, they haven't had their personalities media trained out of them. Two, there's different stories in the women's games. There's same-sex relationships in the same club and maybe on opposition teams. There's women who have babies and come back to play rugby league very quickly. There's issues like menstruation in sport, which, there's so many other issues, and there's so many more interesting interviews. And that's why publishing Shani's book really appealed to me. And we need to get more of these stories out there. But the games themselves, wow. Every time Leeds, York and Saints play each other, they are magnificent games. And Shani told me that yesterday's game was just as good as all of the other times this season where those three have played each other.
I think this is where we, as a sport, we need to push those. I've said this for years, so it's not as if I'm saying anything new again. But if you push those fixtures, which are going to be, or have the potential to be good, you never know how a game is going to go. Obviously, we've seen plenty of games in Men's Super League between top teams that have been absolutely dreadful. But if you put Leeds, Saints and York up against each other, chances are you are going to get a good game. I'm hoping Leeds Saints is on our league or whatever next week, because I know it's been played before the Leeds Salford game on Sunday, which I'm hoping to go to. So it's interesting, because if you look at the coverage of women's football, and Sky use Courtney Sweetnam-Kirk as a pundit a lot. She plays for Sheffield United. They're not in the Women's Super League. So there must be female players out there, whether at the top Super League clubs or not, who have that potential to be personalities. And it's always an open invitation on this program. If people want to come on and try their hand at being interviewed or whatever, come on. It's we're here to give you the experience.
Shani made her debut on Sky a week or so ago when Wigan played Leeds in the women's game, and she did both games. And I thought she was just brilliant. And she had me in stitches when they showed the shot of Fran Goldthorpe scoring that try, and Shani dived at her feet, and she said, "I nearly lost my eyebrows." I thought that was so funny. Just going back to the standard at the top of the Super League in the women's game. I mean, John Davison tweeted a week or so ago that the problem is there's only three good clubs, or three clubs playing at this side. And whilst he's right, 12 months ago, that was only one club playing to the right standard, the standard that we want. Good thing possibly that the World Cup has been delayed by for the England women, because they've now got three clubs playing at the most fabulous standard. And all 6 games this season, I've seen the first 5, didn't see yesterday's, but Leeds, York and Saints, when they play each other, wow, they're all absolutely fantastic games.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's another fantastic game on Sunday between Leeds and Saints. Now, it's good that York have joined the party, and it gives an extra dimension to things, especially because York aren't a big name in the Men's Super League either.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I think it was your tweet that fired them up, Richard. I think they might have finished, third, but you put that tweet out and every player liked it. I thought that was brilliant. And so you've obviously fired them up there. Maybe it's one of those stories that they put it on the dressing room wall to fire them all up. That Richard Shaw-Wright thought they'd finish third.
I mean, if they're listening to me, then they're going wrong. But I did keep tipping Saints to beat Leeds and Castor to beat Leeds, and Leeds would win.
Yeah.
So.
But what a team York have! What a team! Because Tara Jane Stanley, you guys have said, is probably the favourite to win the Woman of Steel. But I think that Sinead Peach and Holly Dodd probably would be second and third. And I asked a mate of mine, which he's an Australian. I said, which women from England would be in your World 13? And well, he said Jodie and Shani from obviously from Saints, but he said Sinead Peach. And of course, she's not even in the England squad. So she's just been named in the night squad. So hopefully that means there is a path back, because I think something might have gone on behind the scenes. And hopefully with her being named in the Knights, obviously she's far too good to be in the Knights. Hopefully that'll be a way back for her, and we might still see her in the World Cup. But she was York's best player yesterday, according to the match report from Dave Parkinson. And, you know, she didn't have starting props. She had 2 back rows as props. So, you know, even without the go forward necessarily, she started a great game.
Yeah, just Dave Judgment having co-commentated, well, not co-commentated, that was the summariser on the Shield final with him last year, which was very much a last-minute thing, having walked into Headingley, and they said, do you want to do some commentary? Well, go on then. I'll sit next to Dave and try to pick the play of the match, which is a difficult thing. But no, it's good to see these games, and it's good to see them getting more publicity. It's a shame that, in a sense, Sky had to show Wigan and Leeds the other week, because it was only ever going to be one result, and you'd hope that they can manipulate the fixtures so that doesn't happen, because that doesn't. I know, as you say, a blowout doesn't necessarily have to be a poor game, but it's not a great reflection. Much like we saw with the Lionesses winning 8-0 or 10-0 or 20-0.
Yeah,
it's easy to then detract from the sport for those who want to do so.
Yeah, any game between those top 3 at the moment, fabulous. And I hope Sky show the playoffs, because second's going to play third in a major semi-final, and wow, what a game that's going to be. You know, but all 3 will still have designs on finishing top. Although Saints are going to have to benefit from a big points difference swing, but it's possible in the women's game because they've got Huddersfield and Wigan still to play. There'll
be some players at York who definitely want to win that League Leaders Shield, because when they were at Castleford, they didn't get any medals for winning the League Leaders Shield, which was controversial at the time. And now they hand out medals for winning the League Leaders Shield. They'll be hoping to go on to glory. I mean, I mentioned mergers. I'm now fully behind, especially with the results yesterday of some kind of combination of Castleford and Wakefield, because it can't be doing anyone any good to be losing. You know, a Super League club shouldn't be losing 50-4 to an amateur club in Lee Miners. And there's no disrespect to Lee, but if you've got a Super League team badge next to your name, that shouldn't happen. And I was there for the 100-0 when Castleford beat Wakefield a few years ago, and it doesn't do anyone any good, especially. I agree. Once you get into 3 figures, but early in the Challenge Cup earlier this year, when Saints had a couple of even 70s and 80s, I firstly just marvelled at what they were doing. And even in the opposition, if it's 70, this might sound ridiculous argument, but it still does imply that they're feeling good play to some extent. And I think there was a good play, because they clearly were good players in that Barrett team, as they've proven, and they lost that game 68 or 72-0, and I could still say they were a good team. No, I remember seeing Wakefield lost to Saints. I think it was 66-0. I was commentating on it pre-COVID and pre-Saints winning anything. And Saints just never gave up the ball. So there's nothing you can do. Yeah.
Well, if you remember back in '96, we had that rule that the scoring team kicked off, and that would make a lot of difference. That really, and I don't know why they went back on that. They do occasionally have good ideas, but then they still panic and think, oh well, this got criticised on a forum somewhere, so we'll go back to what it was. And that was one rule change I liked, that the scoring team kicked off, because it happens in nines, for example, and you just wouldn't get those blowouts necessarily. But hey,
as time runs out on us, what would you change in rugby league? There you go. There's a big question for you to answer in 60 seconds or so.
I think the biggest on-field issue in rugby league is the decline of the British halfback in the summer era. I'm mates with Scoey, obviously, but we went from a time when Scoey and Andy Gregg and Tony Myler were genuinely brilliant players against the Aussies, and they could open up Australian defences at will. We then had an era where, in the early days of the summer era, the best players tended to sort of be individual types, like the Paul brothers and Yestin and the young Sean Long, and then Danny and Rob came through. they were still brilliant Super League players, and Kevin, of course, but they weren't doing anything on the international stage. Throw Leon in there as well. And they've all admitted that, so that's not me being rude. And we've now moved on to another stage where today's halfbacks aren't as good as either of those two groups. And the last World Cup, when Luke Gale had a brilliant season for Cass and then looked like he'd never played Rugby League before in the World Cup, there's got to be a way of sorting that out. And I don't know what the answer is. You can't just sling Gary Schofield on the coaching staff and Andy Gregory. You can't do that. But I don't know what the answer is. But there needs to be some serious looking at why our halfbacks can't go onto the international stage and do the business. Because in all of the positions on the field, we've got players who have done well at test level in the last 25 years, but we haven't had a single scrum half or standoff, with the possible exception of Paul Sculthorpe playing out of position. None of them have done well. And that's the one thing I would want to change about the game.
I mean, the dog agrees. You can't just throw Scully in there.
Yeah.
Here's his name, and she's run off. I mean, you have to do like the women and get Australians in, like Courtney Winfield Hill, and that's the only.
Yeah, I tell you what, as good as Courtney is, I'd still be looking at Zoe Harris. Though I think Zoe Harris is a magnificent player, and scored a try. She just goes through defenders like they're not there. So I get the impression they'll go with Courtney because the social media have really bigged her up when she did switch, and when they do that, you get the impression that the coaches wanted them, but. I think Zoe Harris, for me, it's hard to compare them, but I hope it's not done and dusted. I think it's done and dusted that Georgia Roach is going to be one of the two halfbacks, but I hope the other one is still up for grabs, and I hope that Zoe Harris is. But you're right, yeah. Andrew Johns qualified for Great Britain. We should have done more.
Only him and Matthew Johns and John O'Loma would sign for Wakefield in 2000 would have gone bust. The book is Rugby League on This Day. Where can we get it from?
Well, it's difficult to get books into Waterstones if you're just a nobody like me, but you can buy it on eBay for searching the title. You can buy it at Philip Howard's Books in Leeds, which I believe you might be familiar with, and you can buy it at a shop in St Helens called the St Helens Book Stop. And they're the three places at the moment. But eBay, 12 quid, including postage, and for that you'll get 366 Rugby League stories, and I think that's value for money.
It is indeed. Richard, thank you very much for your time. Apologies for the
No problem.
And
no problem.
We shall no doubt speak to you again soon.
Yeah, cheers. Cheers, Richard.